Hello and welcome to the TripOn podcast, in which we combine architecture, entertainment and urban life. My name is Lee.
My name is Alex, and we're an architect and themed entertainment professionals who travel a lot, but we're also interested in urban development and attractions. And this time, an episode about urban life.
If you want to have an impression of what we saw during our experience, check our Instagram at TripOn Podcast. Yeah, and to start off, we have always a little section where we talk about the trail of our very last visit. And the last time we actually talked about SeaWorld Abu Dhabi. And I wanted to just hear very briefly from you, Alex. What stuck with you from SeaWorld?
I think SeaWorld was actually one of the prettiest indoor parks or entertainment venues that we've visited, and definitely we are recommending it to our friends.
I can really consider that the absolute highlight of what we saw in the Emirates. And I think the two things that we really have to give a shout out is Warner Brothers Abu Dhabi and SeaWorld Abu Dhabi. They are both the best theme parks, I think, in the Emirates. And then this time, actually, it's time to talk about something completely different again. It's been a while ago. We did an episode about urban life last time, which was about the city of Dubai. But we have a very, very interesting city this time. I think it makes you probably very excited as an architect, because we're going to talk about
the city of Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think many people in the world know the name Hong Kong. And maybe it's even a little bit mysterious, or it has some image. And it's really interesting for us. It was always on my short list. And I would love to hear from you a bit of context. What is Hong Kong all about?
I would like to give you some insights for how long are we here and what are we actually doing. So Lee came for about 5 days and I'm here for 2 days. Lee had a bit more time in the city, so I think he will be able to tell us more what he experienced.
Yeah, and I also want to go and tell a bit of background about the city of Hong Kong, because it's a very, very interesting city. So Hong Kong was actually part of China since the Qing dynasty, which is already 214 before Christ. And historically, Hong Kong was always used as a trading harbor, and at some point it was a very bustling harbor that was trading goods with India, especially known for incense, candle wax, and lamp oil. And it's also believed that the name Hong Kong, which actually means fragrant harbor, comes from this period of time. And Hong Kong is also known historically because of its very typical little boats, which are called chungs, if I pronounce it well. And those are those boats with those foldable sails in them.
Hong Kong also has 7.4 million residents of various nationalities, and it is spread within 1,100 square kilometers. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about the geographical location.
So Hong Kong is, of course, on the very south of China. It is right next to a river delta. And Hong Kong consists of a couple of islands, of which the biggest ones are called Hong Kong and Lantau. And then on the mainland, you have the area which is called Kowloon. And Kowloon is a big peninsula. Well, it's not actually a coincidence that Hong Kong is specifically this 1,100 square kilometers, because the region of Hong Kong was very precisely defined. And for that, I have to go back a bit further, because China was, for a very long time, it was a very closed country, and it was only trading with the countries that they chose. But somewhere in the 16th century, it was reached by Europeans, especially the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, and the French. And Hong Kong was always a bit like a smaller harbor city in the shadows of Macau and Canton, which is also now known as Guangzhou. Do you know, actually, Alex, it's an interesting one. What was this very, very precious but also dangerous good that was traded over Hong Kong city?
Okay, let me think. To be honest, I'm not sure. What is it?
It was the very valuable but dangerous opium. And the British got a monopoly on opium, which they transported from India to China. And the British were getting wealthy like crazy on opium. And they generated over 1 million Chinese people to become opium addicts. And it's said that the emperor was so done with it that the emperor started to actually wage a war on the opium trade, which started the very famous Opium War. And in this Opium War, the British were actually fighting against the Chinese. They won territory in Hong Kong, in Canton, and even at some point in Shanghai. And it was during this time, around 1840 and 1841, that the British were confiscating Hong Kong. And this was actually very precisely marked which area around the Hong Kong harbour belonged to the British Empire. And this was during the peak of the Victorian era. And this was when Hong Kong really, really started to grow.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting because opium is not anymore the main export product. I think right now it's gold. It's actually interesting to add to all that you've mentioned that it's also right now fourth most densely populated regions in the world. And Hong Kong has two official languages. One of them is Chinese, which is specifically Cantonese, and also English. So for visitors, I would say it's a little bit easier to go to Hong Kong than, for example, to China, because most of the people will actually speak English. So it's a little bit more accessible for the foreigners.
And what I would like to add to that is that Hong Kong was for a very long time part of the British Empire, but at some point the British already occupied Kowloon and Hong Kong, but they wanted to have the rest of the territories, which they kind of forced the Chinese government to sign a lease on in 1898, and they signed the lease for 99 years. So, of course, it was always coming that in 1997 it would actually expire and they would lose most of the territories. And I think what is important to say is that the reason why Hong Kong is so different is because Hong Kong as an administrative government has been always separate from the Chinese mainland government. So Hong Kong was one of the regions in China where in the 1960s and 70s they started to develop much quicker than mainland China. They did a lot of production. I think a lot of people know about those labels saying made in Hong Kong instead of made in China. And a really big thing was the banking world. And I think one of the most famous banks in the world is maybe a bank that you know of, Alex.
Mm-hmm. HSBC, probably, yes?
Exactly, yeah. The Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, one of the biggest banks in the world that was established there. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting because in the 60s and 70s, but also a little bit more over in the 80s, Hong Kong was really progressive. They were allowing gambling and nightclubs and Western music and the English language. And they had a very, very tough and effective anti-corruption policy. So they were really tough on corruption and on thieves and criminals. And they were one of the first cities in China that started building a mass transit system throughout their entire city. Mm-hmm. And this happened way before the Chinese city development boom. So this is also something you kind of feel in Hong Kong when you're there. It's all a bit old, maybe, but it still functions really well. And I think what is also interesting is that in 1984, the Brits at some point had to negotiate with China as to what would happen to Hong Kong after 1997. And they made a deal that Hong Kong would be given back to China, but under the One Country, Two Systems Treaty. And do you know what it means?
Yes, it means that it is one country, but it has two separate governments in a way, kind of like two separate states.
They made Hong Kong a special administrative region. The Chinese government promised Hong Kong that they would not impose the socialist system after Hong Kong rejoining China, which means that they are separate by economy and governmental administration, but they are joined when it comes to foreign affairs and defense. You have a little bit more experience than me. I didn't necessarily feel the socialist Chinese government or the system, the old communist system of China in Hong Kong. It didn't feel like that at all. And you've been in other parts of China. How do you compare them?
Yeah, I would say there is a difference. I've been so far only to Shanghai and Guangzhou, and you see more of a police on the streets. I think everything is a little bit more arranged and organized. So maybe you see a little bit more of control from the police and the government over the society. Hong Kong has more of that free feel. And we didn't really notice any security or police on the street.
Yeah, and I also have the feeling that it's less censored. So it's much easier to use your phone, your apps, your streaming services.
Definitely. All social media are working and all the other apps, which is not really the case in China. It depends actually on the region in China. Some places I've been to and I could use it with no issues. But for example, in Shanghai, like none of my apps were actually working. So you need to have VPN or just prepare yourself before you go. And in Hong Kong, we had no troubles with that. The only thing was that the Google Maps was a little bit, I would say, in axonometric view, but I think it's because of the layout of Hong Kong, and it was still difficult to navigate. It wasn't working as smooth as it normally works.
Yeah, some things are still different, true. But I did have the feeling that we weren't limited in any way. You know, it was also even the English language is still very much present.
Yeah, it feels much more Western than the other cities of China, for sure.
When you land in Hong Kong, when you actually arrive on the airport, you don't necessarily immediately arrive in the city. Can you explain a bit?
The island where the airport is located is called Lantau, and part of it is actually an artificial island created for the airport purposes because they didn't have as much of a flat land as they needed. And from there, you can easily go to the city by train or by car, taxi.
But also, there used to be an airport in the city center on Kowloon. And if you look at the map, you can still see the runway, which was also already built in sea. But after they moved the airport to another island, they actually now occupy the old runway with buildings again.
I just found also interesting news that they were planning to build another island, another artificial island to add to the city. But for now, they are suspending the investment because it's a very, very big investment. And I think they are looking for the money.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why Hong Kong developed like this is because for a very long time, for more than 100 years, China couldn't invest or build or develop on the Hong Kong territory because it was simply not part of China officially. And that's the reason why China, the China mainland government started to develop their own city north of Hong Kong. Do you know this city?
Do you mean Shenzhen?
Yeah, so Shenzhen is exactly north of the Hong Kong territory, and Shenzhen is a very dense city also. It's almost as dense, I think, as Hong Kong in the amount of inhabitants. And Hong Kong itself actually is part of the kind of like the three cities. Macau is known as the gambling city. It used to be Portuguese territory. Guangzhou is also a very, very rich and quick developing harbor city. But Hong Kong is kind of the harbor city for the banking and for trade.
I actually had the chance to visit Guangzhou, and it's very much about trade and clothing.
Yeah, and I think also Guangzhou is less English, right?
Oh, definitely less than Hong Kong. It's a proper Chinese city, but quite international as well.
I have the feeling that those cities are now really growing towards each other. So I think this whole region is going to be one massive conglomerate of cities. That's a good point to actually move to the next point, which is the city skyline. Hong Kong is by far one of the most famous city skylines, I think, in the world. And especially maybe for you, Alex, as an architect, to see that for real, how was that?
Yes, it's super impressive. And I would say the city is like no other city I've seen before. It has the forest of enormous skyscrapers standing on the hills and also impressive harbour. It has one of most spectacular skylines in the world, I would say, especially by night with the reflection of the lights from the facades of the buildings over the water. When you look into the direction of Hong Kong Island, it's extremely impressive. The buildings are gigantic, super tall, and also the hills make it more special on the background. So it's definitely a city skyline that you will not experience anywhere else.
Yeah, I think also Hong Kong is a very good example of a city that was kind of forced to build like this. because Hong Kong, especially the island of Hong Kong, is pretty steep. It's actually mountainous. And the Kowloon area, so the area which is attached to the Kowloon Peninsula, is much more flat. So when you see the Victoria Harbour, you can also see that the site of Hong Kong, which is actually the older city center, is very, very dense with a lot of very skinny and tall buildings. And the Kowloon side of the harbor is a little bit more spread out with more space, more bigger buildings also, bigger streets also. And I think both of the skylines kind of have their own characteristics from both sides of the Victoria Harbor. And I think the one thing that stands out in Hong Kong is that the skyline looks even more impressive because the buildings are going upwards on the mountain. So it looks even higher and taller and bigger than it actually is measured from ground level.
Yes, and because they didn't have a lot of land, a lot of flat land, the footprint is very small, relatively small, but the towers are extremely high and they just built super, super high.
It's like a crazy collection of towers with like endless rows of apartments. It's so incredibly dense with apartments. I've never seen it like that.
Yes, tiny windows.
Yeah, tiny windows, big rows of tiny windows. If you look at the map of Hong Kong, you see that I think it's quite famously one of the densest cities in the world. But when you look at a map, you still see a lot of green area. Frankly, that's actually the area where they cannot build. So the green area is not just forest area where there's no buildings. Most of the green areas are actually mountain peaks. And because of the climate of Hong Kong, it is very, very green. So there is a bit of this rainforest atmosphere. So let's move on to the head. So we have the section where we talk about the head, the heart, and the base. And the head is when we actually first arrived on our location, and we would talk about our first impression, but also kind of the reputation or the image that a location has going for it and how it actually compares to how we experience it. And first I want to start by saying when you arrive at Hong Kong, and especially when you actually drive from the Hong Kong airport to the more residential areas on Lantau Island, you're already kind of blown away by the residential buildings that are over there. Like there are residential blocks that form an immense wall of apartments over there. And you didn't even see the city center yet.
It's also quite filled with the hotels, of course, because it's near the airport. So there are a few of the newest hotels. And the area is still under the development. So when we arrived, the streets were under construction. And I think they're still a bit working on the whole airport situation.
The Lantau Island is also mountainous, so it's pretty steep. And the airport is completely on the other side of the mountain, so you're unable to see the city of Hong Kong. Even you're unable to see Kowloon from that side of the mountain. You really have to drive around Lantau Island and to connect to the area which is more like the industrial harbor. You always pass the industrial harbor to get into the city. And this island, the Lantau Island, is actually so incredibly green. When you see the amount of effort that they had to put into the highway to connect the islands to each other, it's a massive highway with big tunnels, big bridges. And maybe that's also a thing to mention is that China is really, really good with infrastructural development. And the way that Hong Kong's Lantau Island is connected to Hong Kong is maybe even less impressive as how Lantau Island is connected to Macau, if you know what I mean.
Yes, of course. There is the connection bridge between Macau and Hong Kong, and it's a partially underwater tunnel, which is probably the longest bridge, I think, between the cities in the world.
So we are talking about the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, or the HZMB. It's 55 kilometers long, and it is a cable bridge with a partly undersea tunnel, and it's connecting 4 artificial islands and Hong Kong and Macau to each other. It's the longest sea crossing in the world, and it's the longest open sea fixed link.
Mm-hmm.
It is actually as impressive as it sounds because you can see this from the airplane when you arrive or when you depart, and it's absolutely a sight to behold. I didn't expect it to be so impressive.
Yes, especially that you see part of the bridge and then it suddenly disappears in the water. So it's just impressive.
Yeah, so maybe let's go to the heart of the experience. So what did we do and how was it for us? We actually had our accommodation on Lantau Island, which means that you don't necessarily have to go into Hong Kong City, but there's also something else on Lantau Island. And this is probably pretty world famous.
Yes, it is Disney Hong Kong, and Disney Hong Kong is very close to the airport, actually. So for that reason, we decided to go there on the first day, the next day after we arrived.
This definitely deserves a separate episode because it's just really, really impressive. And
yes, we'll talk about it in a separate episode.
So on the one island, you have Hong Kong Disneyland, but there on the other island, on Hong Kong Island, which is actually situated in the sea south of Kowloon. So you can imagine that also Hong Kong Island is very mountainous. So it has also two sides to it. And on the side of Kowloon is where you can find Hong Kong City. But on the other side, on the back of the mountain, you are actually directed towards open sea. There is a national park, there's a lot of hiking trails, and there is a theme park on the very top of the mountain, which is basically like a marine theme park. So it's kind of a zoo. And that is Ocean Park, Hong Kong. And I don't think a lot of people know about this park, but it is quite well known in the theme park industry. And it's a really weird place. I wanted to see it really bad, but it's a really weird place. And I think we should also do a separate episode about that because there's so much to tell about that park.
All right. I'll ask you more about it in the next episode. So tell us, what did you do besides going to the park? What did you do in the other days?
The climate is very humid and a bit subtropical. It also means that Hong Kong is very cloudy and it rains a lot. And my days in Hong Kong really proved that because I had pretty heavy cloudy skies every day and I had a bunch of really, really strong rainfalls. But then again, if it is dry again, it's quickly warm. So it is a very typical subtropical city. So what I did in a nutshell is I booked a hotel in Victoria Harbour. I really, really wanted to stay in Victoria Harbour. So I booked a hotel with a very high tower. And I specifically requested to be very high up because I wanted to have a view over Victoria Harbour. And I was really happy that I booked that hotel because it's very impressive to see the skyline and Victoria Harbour at night. My hotel wasn't specifically in a very touristy region. It was a bit more to the east on the Hong Kong Island. I had a local contact who I asked what to see and to do in Hong Kong. And he actually advised me to just hop on one of the trams because Hong Kong has double-decker trams. And he said, hop on one tram, go to the upper floor and just enjoy the ride. And that's exactly what I did. So I hopped on a tram. The tram slowly filled with people going to work, a lot of people going to school, like kids going to school, all in uniform, by the way, which is very, very typical to see. And I was just enjoying the ride through the city, and it was really, really impressive. I went to a part of the city where it was much more local. People were having noodles. It's of course a Chinese culture, so people are having noodles in the morning for breakfast. But to be honest, I also really liked it. It is an incredible sight to see how dynamic the city is, how many businesses are there, and how many people are actually living their lives during the day. It's really, really impressive.
Tell us more, what did you experience when you had your time on your own, and what else did you see in the city?
Yeah, so there was one thing that I really wanted to see, and that's actually the kind of the British history in the city. And the current version of the city that you see is very clearly something that developed throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There's, besides, of course, all the residential towers, there's also a lot of really big companies over there with big modern glass towers. But in some places in the city, all of a sudden you see those colonial buildings, either brick buildings or kind of Victorian style buildings. It really reminds you of the old London. And I found one building which was an old police station. This region was called Tai Kwun. And Tai Kwun was basically the central police station where the British police was for a very long time ruling. And they have they had the old prisons over there. Currently, it's actually partly a museum, which you can enter for free. But at night, you can see that it's a very popular place for bars and for clubs. And it has a very Western feel to it. So there's Western music. It's very luxurious. They have nice terraces, good menus with good food. But it was pretty expensive for Hong Kong standards. To be honest, I loved seeing it, but I didn't necessarily feel being there because it didn't really feel like Hong Kong to me. It was interesting to read about it. It's also a bit of an art district now. So they have a couple of art shops and they have some galleries and stuff. So besides that, I really wanted to feel like the real Hong Kong. So I decided to kind of move away from the city center or from the more commercial area of Hong Kong and to move more actually in between those famous residential towers. And I can hardly describe how that felt, but it truly felt like I was in an anime movie. It was just apartments everywhere you looked. When you are really surrounded by those towers, you have almost no way to see the sky. It is so incredibly dense and it's so impressive. You feel so small as a human being. And then you also see how complicated everything is set up. How steep are the roads, that there's so many passages, underpassages, tunnels, stairways, even still very high up in the mountains, there was still metro stations. Like I have no idea how they built that stuff. It's pretty impressive. And I just started walking throughout these residential areas and you see how layered that city is. There's so many basements, parking garages, commercial spaces, and you don't necessarily always know where's the entrance of a building, where's the ground floor. Where's the upper floor? Where does the escalator take you? I think you really have to live there to understand the complexity of how the city is set up.
Do you think it was built like this from the beginning, or it was all added with time and with the needs of the city?
Well, I have the feeling that much of the very dense residential complexes are from an older time. So they're probably from a time when they didn't necessarily have very strict rules and regulations concerning buildings. One thing that was very, very iconic to experience in Hong Kong is a very famous escalator. It's called the Central Mid-Levels Escalator in English. And it was actually built for practical reasons because Hong Kong is so incredibly steep that it was very difficult for people from a certain residential area to come down to the city center. So the government actually built kind of like a chain of roofed escalators, but next to that there's normal stairs. And it is so iconic that it slowly became a tourist attraction. And I really, really wanted to see this escalator, but I was very lucky to experience it without many tourists. But I just kept on going. I kept on going up and up and up and up. I wanted to go as high as possible. And to be honest, when you're standing on those escalators and you're moving automatically past layers of the city, it feels like an anime movie because you are moving past. Then it's street level. Then all of a sudden there's a level with a barber. Then there's a nail salon. Then there's a noodles place. Then there's a daycare full of children. Then there's a balcony with a little dog. It's so hard to describe, but you are continuously experiencing different levels of the city, and it's almost surreal. Because those escalators, sometimes they connect to roof terraces, little parks, sometimes to the cliffs. And really, sometimes there is a little bridge into the building. So I experienced a couple of moments on the escalator where you can just get off and you can go into a convenience store, which is somewhere, somewhere on a certain level in the building. Or there is a little furniture shop or something. Or yeah, it's very surreal. It was a really special experience.
But do you think because of that the city is more accessible for people with reduced mobility?
I think that this is traditionally something that China, and with China I mean Greater China, is normally pretty good at, to actually accommodate infrastructure and also city planning for elderly, because the elderly and the less mobile, they are also very important to the society. And I have the feeling that in Hong Kong, a lot of people walk in general, because it's also very, very inconvenient to be moving around with cars too much. And you can imagine when your city is consisting of so many dense and tall towers with literally thousands and thousands of apartments, it's very unpractical if everyone is driving a car. I think it's even impossible.
Yeah, for sure.
So what you see is that just many, many people are just walking through the city. And I think they really facilitate that walking. They really try to facilitate the pedestrian in the city. And that's is really impressive. And I actually also have a question for you, because I spent a couple of days in the city center. You were happily actually also able to join for a couple of days. And there was this one evening, and that was the first time when you actually went into Hong Kong City, because the first day we spent mostly on Lantau Island. But how was that for you? How was it to actually move into the city?
First, I took the Airport Express train, which took me from the airport area, so Lantau Island, to the central station. And I have to say, everything works super smooth and it was very easy to navigate around. We've met in the city center and we've decided to walk together to Lang Kwai Fong, which is LKF district, and it's pretty well known also for touristic spots where people just meet, go have some drinks. There are many bars around, and also it's pretty known for the nightlife. However, when we arrived, it was already pretty late. We were also a bit tired, and the places I had the feeling were already a bit closed. So maybe it was this day of the week.
Yeah, but I also had the feeling that that was also a very specific audience, It was more like British, Canadian, Germans looking for fun, drinking, etc. We were not in the mood. So we were more culturally interested in the city.
For sure. And we also had a walk. So this was also first time when I've experienced the multi-layered city that you've mentioned. And we had the chance to see the escalators there. So it was very impressive. Was not crowded as well because it was pretty late. The only challenge was that because we were moving to another hotel, so Lee was moving back from the city center hotel to Lantau Island, he had his suitcase with him. And we had to drag this suitcase in the mountainous area, which was quite challenging, I have to say, because the sidewalk was quite hilly.
I think it was in that moment that we realized how steep some of the streets are.
Yes, because when you walk just like that, you don't really realize. But if you have to carry something, then it's becoming a thing.
Like some of the actual rocky cliffs that are right in the city center, it's crazy. And sometimes streets are connected by, for example, like a pedestrian tunnel, which is a very steep stairway, or there's many little alleys and passages, and it's a crazy city design.
Yes, it has so many layers. And then we decided to take the taxi to go back to Lantau Island. And the taxis are also quite of an interesting case because they all look very old, kind of like you can recognize taxis in New York or London. But the ones in Hong Kong, they're also quite recognizable, I would say.
Apparently, it is entirely overseen and regulated by the government. And there are 3 colors of taxis: the red taxis, the blue taxis, and the green taxis. And the color determines which region of Hong Kong the taxi is allowed to serve according to their taxi license. The red taxi is called the urban taxi, and that's actually the taxi that can serve the biggest region within the Hong Kong territories. And they're also generally a bit more expensive than the blue and the green ones, because the blue one is serving Lantau Island mainly, and then the green one is serving the new territories, which is a bit more on the north of Hong Kong. But there's a bit of overlap between all of them. Another thing that stood out to us is that the Hong Kong taxis in general, they look very iconic. They look a bit dated in a way, because many of the taxi cabs are very boxy. And I looked into that, and apparently Hong Kong has been replacing their American cars mostly with Japanese cars at some point. And the most popular car models are actually the Nissan Cedric and the Toyota Crown, but from the 90s, so the Toyota Crown from 1997, for example. And many of those cars have been driving around ever since, which is why you have this iconic Hong Kong taxi that looks so 90s. But we have to be honest, they are incredibly comfortable.
And it's quite recognizable. You always know that this is the taxi. So we've decided to take one to go back to Lantau area. And from there, we've planned our next day, which was super packed.
We actually managed to see much more than only Hong Kong city center, because we had this idea, which is especially, I think, something that you are aware of, to visit an iconic tourist attraction.
Yes, so especially the hotel that we stayed was offering a shuttle to go to Nongding 360 cable car, which is a cable car that gives an opportunity to see Hong Kong from above, especially the Lantau Island from above. And I think it's very unique to be able to see those monstrous buildings from the top. The cable car actually is leading towards the Big Buddha, which is very touristic attraction. It's called Tiantan Buddha, and it's tallest outdoor statue of seated Buddha. It has 35 meters. And I was a little bit checking how it was done. So it's a framework steel on the inside and bronze around. To be honest, I was really eager to see it because I thought that it will be a very iconic monument to visit. But after we checked, and actually Lee made me more aware of that, the Buddha is not really as old as it seems to be. It was only built in 1993. We
didn't really investigate that much, but it was something actually that we both wanted to see. We knew that it wouldn't be a massive trip. We were pretty close to it with the hotel. Mm-hmm. And I think it became pretty clear, first of all, when you go by cable car, you also realize how much of Hong Kong is not built. It's really natural. You're going over the very green mountainous area, and it's incredibly foresty. And all the way in the top, when we got out of the cable car, we realized, okay, it looks like a traditional village, but it's not. It looked very artificial.
This very much a tourist trap.
Yeah.
But what is interesting is that the Buddha was actually an investment from the monastery. So Pauline Monastery is actually an actual monastery that was located there, but they wanted to create a tourist attraction that people would have a chance to go there and visit this beautiful viewpoint. And they also had an idea to create a place to show the stability of Hong Kong, prosperity of China, and also peace on earth. So they had a deeper meaning behind it.
The Buddha itself, it is very impressive, the location. And the last part of the trip to this Buddha is by a pretty big stairs, pretty steep big stairs.
Yes.
Leading up to it.
Yes, around 268 steps. So it's quite of a hike up.
Yeah, and eventually we went up, we went into the actual statue, because the bottom of the statue is a building, open building, which has an exhibition about it. Even though it's pretty modern, it's still impressive. It's not, maybe from up close, it's not as beautiful as it looks from the photos. And we were really happy later that we went early morning, because when we went, there was almost no one there, and that actually really enhanced the experience. Mm-hmm. But then later it became so incredibly crowded.
Definitely the tip would be to go there as early in the morning as possible. I also found some info, because the Buddha is sitting in a specific way, that one of his hands is raised up. So the right hand side of Buddha is raised, and it means the removal of affliction. And then the left hand is resting open on his lap in a gesture of generosity.
Yeah, it was also, unfortunately, when we were there, very cloudy, but it's very common in Hong Kong. So we didn't have we had a very mysterious looking Buddha because it was like completely in the clouds, but we didn't have the view, unfortunately. Yeah, and also what was impressive is that when we took the cable car back, from the cable car, you have a really good view on the airport. And then you see that the airport is actually a really big man-made artificial plateau in the sea, which is really impressive.
And then we took the train or a metro and we went to the city. We decided to go for the local markets. So we were just walking around. We were looking for something to eat. We could see fruit markets and markets with clothes and other products that were sold. They were selling durian also on the street.
Yeah, for who doesn't know, durian is a controversial fruit. Yeah, it is controversial because it smells. It smells pretty bad.
It does smell and it has specific taste, but to be honest, it has something. And there are two types of people actually. Either you love it or you hate it. But I would describe it as a very soft mango, like almost falling apart mango. After we were walking around and checking what are people selling and what are the stalls, we decided that we're a little bit hungry. We found one restaurant, which was actually a hidden restaurant that you have to take escalator and go a couple of floors up to find it. And I think it was Chinese restaurant, so we just had noodles and some beef.
Maybe that's also an interesting thing because what we said about the layers of this city, the same counts for the commercial spaces, but also the restaurants, the shops. You don't necessarily always see immediately what is on offer on street level. In many cases, it's really interesting to just look at signs. There's always a bunch of signs. Sometimes there's like 4 or 5 signs standing next to each other. And you really need to check on the sign which floor the actual offer is about. Because sometimes you have a sign of a restaurant and you still need to go 5 floors up for that restaurant. So, you know, it's very comparable to what I saw in some other Asian cities, is that you can find amazing places. You just have to really, really look for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the food was very nice. It was local food with some local drinks, and we enjoyed it.
In general, I think every time we had something in Hong Kong, it was really good. Quality was good.
And after that, we decided to go to the harbour side. So we took the bus. And this was actually very nice because we could experience the roads and see it from the street perspective. And we went to Victoria Harbour.
Yeah, we went to also a pretty iconic location in Hong Kong. That is the what's it called? The West Kowloon Art Park, or the Art District. From what I know, it's also, again, man-made area, and there are a couple of museums clustered together. Plus, it is also the location of one of the most famous buildings in Hong Kong. Do you know which one?
Do you mean M Plus building?
So the M Plus building is a famous one, but I'm talking about a skyline dominant building. The International Commerce Center, which is in the list of the tallest buildings in the world. I don't know exactly where it's ranking right now, Alex, maybe you know?
Yes, let me look it up for you. Okay, so according to the ranking, is around 6th place of the tallest buildings in the world right now. It is just higher than the Petronas Towers in Malaysia and just a little bit shorter than the Shanghai World Financial Center. So it's in between those two.
Yeah, and what stands out to me is that this building is so tall and it is so kind of like disconnected from the overall skyline that it kind of dwarfs the rest of the city. It really stands out as this one behemoth standing there at Victoria Harbour. It's pretty crazy. It has also an observation deck. I checked it twice. The second time we were there, it was already closed. The first time I was there, I saw how incredibly expensive it is. It's really expensive. It's very much a tourist trap. What is nice, by the way, about the art park is it's really green. It's a very nice way to stroll around. Also, the very tip of this park has a beautiful view over the Hong Kong skyline on the Hong Kong island. And the Hong Kong side and the Kowloon side are really well connected by a lot of ferries and also by a couple of metro lines.
I think there's also quite a big shopping center around.
Yeah, very luxury shopping center. Yeah.
And in general, it's a more modern, more art-oriented district, I would say, with art museums and galleries.
So let's go to the base of the experience. We can kind of say what stuck with us. Like what was the thing that stuck with us after a while and why?
I would say for me, definitely tightly packed tenement buildings, often used in movies, actually, and beautiful nature and landscape.
I definitely prefer cities sitting in subtropical environments. I think Hong Kong, especially with its access to open sea and with its mountains, I think it has all the ingredients for a really, really impressive cityscape. I have a weak spot for that. What I really liked about it is that you had, for example, these impressive, massive residential towers, and then they are on ground level completely overgrown with those root systems, from the subtropical trees, and there's waterways all over the place. After heavy rain, there are like waterfalls streaming throughout the city here and there, and it's very special to experience that combination of rugged nature and man-made cityscapes.
It's in a way wild, but very arranged, so it's like a mix of both.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk a bit about food and drinks. What was a typical thing that you tried in Hong Kong that you liked or that stuck with you?
What I was recommended to try was the egg tart. And I was thinking, what is this egg tart? We should definitely try it. And then I realized this is the same egg tart as is very famous in Portugal. And I was wondering, actually, was it first in Hong Kong or was it first in Portugal area? And I think it was more in Europe. They love it. There is a lot of egg tart places. What's more? Definitely bubble tea.
Yeah, bubble tea is pretty popular, yeah.
Yes, bubble tea is from Taiwan, but definitely in Asia it's a thing in general. And which flavor was your favorite one? I think it was the brown sugar one.
Yeah, kind of the classic one, I would say, right? The brown sugar one. And there is a whole district in Hong Kong where there's a lot of bubble tea places. I think besides that, what is a very common thing in Hong Kong to eat is cow stomach. It sounds terrible, but it's a very common thing to eat it in a soup, like in a noodle soup. And they also really, really like their pork. There's a lot of pork in general.
And noodles.
In general, noodles are incredibly, incredibly popular in Hong Kong. It's also because the Chinese, in general, culturally eat noodles throughout the whole day. So they start with noodles in the morning and they eat it also often in the evening.
What about the dumplings and dim sum? Is it also a thing in Hong Kong?
Yeah, they're eating a lot of dumplings. I also tried a lot, and to be honest, it's very good in many places. I generally didn't really have any bad experience with food. Also in terms of pricing, they're really quick with service. Another thing that I tried in Hong Kong, which was also something I saw in many places, is grass jelly. So it's like a black jelly. It's like black jelly blocks. And in my case, it was combined with fruit and with...
rice pudding or...
Rice pudding, yeah. And I had it with coffee and I actually really enjoyed it. I have no idea exactly what it is, but still I enjoyed it. Maybe I shouldn't look it up. I would love to talk about our professional view, but I do want to hear from you, from an architect. How do you look at the city of Hong Kong, and maybe even how does it compare to something like, for example, Dubai, the city that we talked about last time?
Just to begin with, due to the lack of available land and the mountainous terrain that we've mentioned, but also because of the volcanic rock and granite, they are building tightly packed tenement buildings. And they are extremely iconic. Like I've mentioned before, they are used in movies. Some of them are used in some artworks. There is one very famous building. It's called the Monster Building. It has 18 floors, but I've seen a lot of photos of it photoshopped where people copy floors so they make it look even higher. And the Monster Building has the shape of letter M. That's why also it's called like that. But mainly the name comes because it is just so terrifying. When you stand in the middle, in the courtyard of it, you are surrounded by the walls, and only if you look up you can see the sky. Otherwise you are in the wall of building. And it kind of looks like a prison. It's very special. However, still many people live there, so the building is occupied. I think there are about 10,000 people living there. So you have to be quite conscious when you go there and not really disturb them for the pictures and, of course, when you want to check it out. Another thing that we were very much amazed about are the different layers. And I kind of can say it is reminding me a little bit of Dubai, because Dubai also has those passages from the metro when you have to go somewhere. And because of the climate, they need the air-conditioned space, so they create those tunnels. But it's nothing like Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has extremely dense walkways and they overlap each other and one is connecting with another. And Dubai is more spread, definitely. It's not as compact and not as dense as Hong Kong.
And definitely not as pedestrian friendly, I guess.
Oh, definitely not. Dubai is car oriented, and if you compare it to Hong Kong is very much pedestrian friendly and you can move everywhere by walking, which is not really a case in Dubai, because sometimes in Dubai you cannot really reach destination walking.
I spent some time on this art district that we were talking about earlier, and there is one building that really stood out to me, and I looked it up later. It's called the Kowloon Ventilation Building, weirdly enough. And this art park is actually on a hill, so you have the hill going downwards towards the sea, and when you are on the top of the hill, especially during sundown, this Kowloon Ventilation Building truly looks like a spaceship that just landed in the field. And I made some beautiful photos. I can really recommend, if you're listening to this podcast, to check our Instagram. I will try to drop a couple of those photos over there. And it seems very conscious by the city to make this building look so futuristic. There's actually two ventilation buildings in this park. There is the Kowloon Ventilation Building and there's the Western Harbour Crossing Ventilation Building. And both of the buildings look really futuristic and pretty dominant over there. It's almost as if the city is like, yeah, we need it, so let's just make it look nice. Yeah, I really like that kind of like the photo op of that.
There is also M Plus building, which is an art museum.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty recent building. It's very modern.
Mm-hmm.
And the location is pretty special because it is right on the bank of the Victoria Harbour. There is also the Hong Kong Palace Museum, which is also pretty new. And this museum highlights the old Hong Kong Palace, which doesn't exist anymore. I think it was destroyed. But there's also an exhibition. It's a very modern building with a pretty famous balcony that allows you to take really great photos of the city skyline.
There is also quite some controversy about the Hong Kong Palace Museum. There was supposed to be public consultation beforehand, which is a very common thing before you propose something new as the city, to actually ask the citizens what do they think about it and what do they like, what do they need. And there was apparently one, but they were more into the design of the museum than about the operation and if it's really necessary.
Yeah, I think you can say it's a statement piece. this piece of architecture. When you look it up, you can already see that's definitely put there because of its aesthetic, mainly.
Yeah, I think this was meant to be catchy in a way.
I was in that museum. It's very modern. It's a beautiful, very orchestrated, well-arranged building, and it's really interesting to learn all about the former historic Hong Kong and to see the drawings of the palace and the layout and the history of Hong Kong, etc. But it also kind of reminds you that Hong Kong has been going through such a crazy development that there is not so much Chinese history anymore in the city. I think most of it is replaced right now.
There is also the Bank of China Tower. It's one of most recognizable landmarks in Hong Kong, and it's consisting of triangular frameworks covered by glass curtain walls. So it is quite recognizable. You can see the triangles, and they are lit nicely at night. There is also another building talking about interesting shapes, the Jockey Club Innovation Tower, which was actually designed by Zaha Hadid. It was finished around 2014, and it is a university building with shape of a wing, I would say.
Yeah, and you know what's an interesting fact about the Jockey Club? It is one of the oldest institutes in Hong Kong. Because Hong Kong, of course, was heavily influenced by the British, and the British introduced a lot of horse-based sports. That's why in Hong Kong, jockeys and horse racing and even betting on horse racing is incredibly popular. And that was one of the things when Hong Kong became part of China again, that the Chinese government promised they would allow, even though Hong Kong would be part of China again, because Hong Kong is, of course, much more progressive in that regard. And in socialist China, something like that is really not allowed normally, you know, the gambling and all that stuff. And until this day, that is incredibly popular in Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong Jockey Club is a very famous institute.
I have also one of the facts, interesting facts. It is about the holes in the skyscrapers. Do you know why Hong Kong skyscrapers have holes?
Yeah, I noticed that many skyscrapers have holes in them, especially from a certain era, it seems. And it is often regarded as being typical Hong Kong.
I think it has something to do also with the building law. So there is the airflow, because the walls of the buildings are so huge that they just maybe need some airflow to create the gaps in the buildings. But there's also a feng shui driven belief that the openings are created for the dragons to come out from the mountains and go through the buildings.
Yeah, I do believe that there's some truth in that, because Hong Kong is also pretty windy, obviously, because it's very close to open sea. But, you know, the story about dragons is also cool.
And another interesting thing is about lights, because the city skyline is extremely interesting during the nighttime, because the city is beautifully lit with colorful lights which are reflecting on the water. But there is also a very interesting thing about neons, that Hong Kong used to be a city of neons, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about it.
Mainly because Hong Kong is one of those cities where they used especially the big towers for advertising purposes. So many big brands were actually advertising their logos on the Hong Kong buildings. And I think that's also what you could probably recognize from old photographs of the Hong Kong city skyline, is that it was really, really dominated by neons. And a bit like Beijing, or like Piccadilly Circus in London, or like Times Square in New York. Unfortunately, the neons have been disappearing. And it also happened to, for example, Times Square in New York, is that the neons have been gradually replaced by LED lighting, and in some cases by LED screens. And I really think that artistically the neons were much prettier and they were much nicer to look at than the LED lighting. Right now, I think the skyline is still very impressive at night, but I can only imagine how much nicer it must have been when it was still dominated by neons.
Yeah, I can totally agree. It definitely had much more of the character. That's why also Hong Kong was used as a film city because of those neons. It was that unique and full of them that the filmmakers were just using the city for the production.
And one of the most famous movies or movie franchises that was recorded in Hong Kong is the Batman trilogy by Christopher Nolan. Especially in the first movie, Batman Begins, the ghetto shots or the ghetto sections of the movie were predominantly shot in Hong Kong, especially in the areas in Kowloon or on Hong Kong Island, where it was really dense and really vibrant and dynamic and full of people, and this typical nighttime, a bit dangerous ghetto feel. Besides that, in The Dark Knight, they have those really beautiful shots over Hong Kong City and over the skyline, over the skyscrapers for the sections where Batman is flying through the city. And it was pretty special to actually see the city for real, because I really like that series. One really famous building, or actually more of an accumulation of different buildings, was called Kowloon Walled City. For anyone who is interested in cities and in urban planning, but especially who is interested in like really interesting, mysterious stories about cities, I would really urge you to look up Kowloon Walled City. There's a lot of documentaries about it. It was for a very long time the densest place on Earth, and it's now demolished because it was very dangerous. It was architecturally, it was famous all over the world because it was kind of like an improvised superstructure, and it doesn't exist anymore, but it must have been incredibly impressive. It was one of the craziest mega structures ever created, because it was just a combination of tiny buildings, and it was almost like a city in itself. Architects even referred to it as an organism, because it was such a complicated beast that it was like a living thing. There was like a society living there with their own rules and regulations, and with their own infrastructure pathways routing throughout. There was also a lot of crime in there, apparently. And architecturally, of course, it was a mystery how that thing even existed, because it wasn't built according to any engineering. It just kind of grew over time. I love the story about that, and it's almost sad that we were not able to see it. From what I know, there's now a park where it used to be, and there's like some sort of like
memorial.
Yeah, there's like some sort of memorial for it now, with a little miniature and a museum about it. And we didn't go there, but next time I would be in Hong Kong, I would definitely go there and see the original site. Okay, room for improvement.
I definitely think that the city had its unique character, and here maybe I can say that there is a room for improvement for us, because there's one thing I a little bit regret for not doing, is the hikes. I think it would be amazing to have a little bit more time and to be able to see maybe the nature, maybe go a bit out of the city. But for the city, I do think it was quite clean, actually, for especially Asian and Chinese city. It was clean, but I think it can always be cleaner.
Yeah, there are sections of the city where it is pretty dirty. I mean, there's some trash, there's some, dirty streets. It's a bit messy, a bit chaotic.
Around the markets. Around the market stools area. But in a way, it had its own character, and I didn't have the feeling that it was gross or, like very dirty. What is it for you?
Yeah, so for me, actually, I really like this combination of this traditional Hong Kong combined with this modern and this more Western touch to it. Yes, a lot of stuff is in English. Like, that's really good about Hong Kong. But I do notice that there's many people who don't speak English in Hong Kong. And I think that's okay. But I do have the feeling that it might be better for them also from a international tourist point of view to really keep that alive. The fact that things can be done and seen and read in English, I think that's a very strong point about Hong Kong. It makes it very accessible to foreigners. And I really, really hope that they can keep that a bit more alive. I have the feeling, but maybe I have it wrong, but I have the feeling that English is maybe disappearing a bit as one of the leading languages. It seems like Cantonese is really taking over, and also Cantonese writing is really taking over. I really hope that they hold on to it.
Also, we have another position, which is grumpy minutes. So what was bothering us and what could be improved as well. Do you have anything like that?
I was pretty disappointed about what is considered one of the tourist highlights normally for Hong Kong, which they call the biggest light show in the world. Yeah, it's called Symphony of Lights, and it is marketed even by the Hong Kong government as a nighttime show. And there are certain viewing locations along the harbour where you can take a look from the waterfront. And it is basically an orchestrated light show where the different buildings are in sync with each other, and there should be like a programmed light show.
Okay. Is it at specific hour that they are doing it, or is it the whole night?
No, it's every evening at 8 o'clock. And I was there at 8 o'clock. And it's pretty disappointing. I don't know exactly what happened over time, but I think it could have been really impressive. And maybe it was at some point really impressive, but maybe they've been losing interest a bit. It was a bit underwhelming to me. Okay, so let's go to the absolute highlights of the visit. If I may start, I actually have one thing that I experienced while walking through the city, which was really impressive. There is a big park in the Kowloon district, and this park is basically surrounded by big roads, and of course surrounded by big tall buildings. But this park is also connected by a lot of pedestrian bridges on all sides. The buildings already themselves have like commercial layers that are not on street level, but they're on higher levels, and the buildings are all interconnected. You kind of lose track of on which level you are. And then from those levels, you have pedestrian bridges connecting to the bridges that go to the park. And I walked into this park and I was walking over a pedestrian bridge, over a sports field, over a swimming pool even, a public swimming pool. And then I continued walking. The park was consisting of a lot of seating spaces and waterfalls and some traditional buildings. And it was really, really impressive. I was really thinking like, this park is so incredibly green and so well laid out for pedestrians, and everything is so layered again. The public pool that is like under you, and buildings that are over you, and multi-level rocky hills all throughout the park, sometimes with water and sometimes with seating areas, sometimes with social spaces, maybe places where they even play games. That was really, really impressive, especially in the evening.
Mm-hmm. So you mean the city life in general, that people are hanging around and having a nice time?
Yeah, I think if you break down Hong Kong, and you can say that Hong Kong is a modern city which experienced its peak throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, combined with Chinese tradition, but with Western influences. I think it's like the perfect mix for me, you know, and this all set in a subtropical green mountainous environment. It's really, really, really impressive.
Yeah, to add to it, I would just say that also it has the feeling of safety. You don't really feel endangered. I think people are very friendly and helpful in general. And what is also quite cool is the octopus card, which is a city card that you can use for transportation, payment. When you go out in the restaurants, you can maybe even pay in the local market with it. So it's very easy to navigate in the city. So it's quite a good tip for people going to download the card.
Hong Kong was in the field of city planning in the past always used as an example for how not to do city planning. It was apparently a very famous phrase to say, we shouldn't become Hong Kong. There has been a moment in the past when Hong Kong was pretty dirty and too full and too dense, and there was really bad air quality. And I think it still has this image from that period of time. But it's also known that Hong Kong, especially the Hong Kong government, was basically done with that. And they wanted to get rid of that face, of that image. And they started to really improve the city in terms of public transport, cleaning it up, making people aware, doing much more for pedestrians. And I have to say that having been in Hong Kong now, of course, I don't know the former version of Hong Kong, but having been there now, I just have to praise that they really, really improved, I think, Hong Kong and what it has to offer, because the current version of Hong Kong is really, really well set up for walking around, for experiencing the city. I didn't feel unsafe. The public transport is from a totally different level. It's incredibly well done. And all of that in an area that is difficult to build in, on rock, on islands, around sea, around harbors. Yeah, I have to praise the city for really, really well organized policies, I think.
So definitely this gives hope for other cities that maybe now seem to be not arranged in a perfect way, that there is an opportunity always to improve, and Hong Kong is a great example of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe other cities should look at Hong Kong, like how did they do it, you know? For being one of the most dense places in the world, I might have expected more chaos, to be honest.
Yeah, that's true. It definitely feels arranged and organized.
It feels like organized chaos, which is really nice for a city.
Concluding our story about Hong Kong, now it's the time to ask a question. If we would like to visit it one more time and recommend it to you, or you should avoid it. So this is my question to you, Lee. Would you say that Hong Kong is a trip off, consider, or trip on?
I would definitely say trip on. I think I might have even fallen in love with Hong Kong a little bit. I really, really enjoyed being there, and it almost felt sad to leave again. Maybe also partly because it was an incredible experience in Disneyland Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's true. I would also say trip on. And to be honest, I could even live there for a while. I think it's such rich place culturally that it could be interesting to experience it more.
I think it is the perfect place for a trip, and it's the perfect place to kind of touch upon the Chinese culture without going fully into the Socialist Republic of China. So that concludes our episode about the city of Hong Kong. It was really nice to, again, spend an episode on urban life, which we haven't done for a while, and I really hope to do that more often.
So the next is very exciting episode coming up about Disney Hong Kong, and it is a very special visit because for me it was the second park that I've seen from Disney. I think it exceeded our expectations.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about this park because it was much more unique, I think, than we both anticipated. And as always, we say, our tip:
go on and plan your next trip.